I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. This is Jesus' words to his followers. And as you hear that, you're thinking, man, this is like grade A Bible stuff, right? But as I read this, and in light of our current cultural moment, I wonder for you, have these sorts of Bible verses ever felt like empty statements that you've heard? Maybe your grandma slapped above her kitchen sink. These are verses that you believe are true, and yet, have you ever felt like when push comes to shove, when you look around at our world, these verses don't really seem to make a difference? I mean, we watch the news and the effects and the reopening of COVID is long, and we're kind of tired of being indoors. We see traumatic videos like Ahmaud Arbery and dealing with that and seeing that all over the news. Our parents might be out of work. Prom is a no-go. Senior year is finished. Sports are over. It's like, man, Graham, you're really about to tell me these statements that Jesus made. I've overcome the world. The church will prevail. I will be with you. Okay, sure. That sounds awesome. And yet here you are. You're watching me through a Zoom screen or through, a computer screen, watching YouTube. And here I am sitting in a place in which we used to come together, a place that was filled with so much life and fun, announcements and games and worship. And it sits dormant, vacant, just as we left it. It really sits in shambles. And those promises from Jesus that I read at the beginning of this, man, it sounds awesome, but where are they? And when are they actually going to take place? Have you ever felt that sort of tension? Have you ever wondered that? I think the problem with promises is that they're time sensitive. Meaning, like, if someone promises you something, that there's a window of time in which fulfilling that promise is okay. But after a certain period of time, if that person waits too long, and those promises, those commitments, if left unmet, man, can feel void, can feel useless. And I think that's because the problem with promises is that they are time sensitive. We set our expectations based upon what people promise us and the time frame in which they promise to deliver. And if those don't get met, man, it can shatter us. Have you ever had somebody promise you something and not live up to their end of the bargain? Not deliver on what they promised? Hey, I promise we'll spend more time together. I just got to finish this one work thing. That one work thing never seems to be done. I promise we're going to be reopening soon. Get back to normal. We've just got to wait. Well, here we are, still waiting. I promise I'll be at your next game. There's another empty seat in the stadium. And when someone promises us something and we frame an expectation based around that promise of when we think it's going to happen, and when it doesn't, it can be devastating. I think we all at some level can relate to this problem of unmet promises. And not only us, but humans for centuries have experienced this familiar feeling of, okay, we see this happening, but what do we do about it? Where is God in the midst of this? God's people in the Old Testament are very familiar with this emotion and feeling of, all right, we hear these promises, but when are they actually going to take place? And I want to take just a few moments to talk about a guy named Haggai. Haggai was a prophet to the nation of Israel right after a crazy time in Israel's history. If you don't know much about who Israel was or who they are, Israel in the Old Testament was called to be God's chosen people. They were going to be the vessel through which all of the promises of God were going to come to fulfillment. And these promises were made through these things called covenants, and you can think of a covenant as just like a massive pinky promise, basically. And the pinky promises that were made to Israel by God were promises such as that God was going to bring them to this incredible land. God was going to bless them as a people. He was going to be their God. They were going to be his people. He was going to set an awesome king over them to rule with righteousness and rule with justice. It sounded amazing. But Israel had a tough time upholding their end of the pinky promise, which, ultimately was to follow after God's heart. And when they wouldn't do that, and when they didn't do that consistently, God basically said, hey, those promises of blessing are actually going to become promises of cursing. You're going to be scattered. You're not going to be my people because you serve other gods, other statues, as if they are the true God. You're not going to have an awesome king over you. You're going to have a king who's like a bully. And that's what happened. Israel was scattered due to their hearts worshiping other statues as if they were the true God, having a king over them that wasn't ruling with justice and righteousness, but was ruling with oppression, was bullying them. And during this time, God would send messengers called prophets to basically say, hey, while this time is bad, while it looks bad, it's not the end of the game. In fact, God said you're going to be scattered for 70 years, and after those 70 years are finished, I'm actually going to bring you back from being scattered, from being held in captivity. I'm going to bring you back to the land of Jerusalem. And as you read the Old Testament, you'll find that's exactly what happened. God orchestrated that the hateful bully ruler who was over Israel was replaced by a ruler who would actually support Israel in helping them get back to the land that God promised them and helping them rebuild the city of Jerusalem. It seemed incredible. But time goes on, and that ruler who helped support Israel in getting back to the land, his name was Cyrus, he was replaced by another ruler, a guy named Artaxerxes. Some crazy names, right? And Artaxerxes actually banned Israel from rebuilding their city. And so Israel's plans of rebuilding God's city, his temple, and living to see these promises that they couldn't wait to happen, living to see them take place, all of this seems to be foiled. The problem with promises is that they're time sensitive. Put yourself in their situation. I mean, you've got to be thinking, if you're an Israelite, okay, what about the 70 years and then we're back partying with God thing? Like, when is that coming? You know, God, did you just bring us back to this land promising plenty and all those other things, but now just to have another ruler oppressing us like we've known in the past? It doesn't seem like God is upholding his end of the bargain in this deal. Like, what's going on? The people of Israel must have been feeling. And how are the people going to respond in the face of this opposition? That's when Haggai enters the story. Haggai chapter 1 says this: In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? The problem with promises, yes, you guessed it, is that they are time sensitive. If somebody says, yo, I'll jump up on Fortnite to squat up at 8 p.m., you expect them to be there, right? If God says to Israel, after 70 years, I'll bring you back to this land and you're going to flourish in this land, rebuild it and rebuild the temple, man, then the people of Israel are going to expect that after 70 years of being scattered in captivity and finally being able to come back home and have the ruler's support in helping rebuild the city and rebuild the temple, that, man, everything's going to work out great. But here enters the problem with promises. Israel sets their expectations based upon what God has promised them, and then when that doesn't seem to be happening in the way in which they expected it to happen, they are devastated. They're let down. And how do they respond? They respond with laziness. Verse 2, God sends Haggai to call the people out of their slumber. It says this: these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Verse 4, but is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? The people are saying, the time has not yet come. I don't know about you, but when I think about that statement, not yet is oftentimes, at least when I say it, just a less offensive way of saying never, right? Because it makes people feel like they can be comfortable with delaying something, with not acting on it. You ever said not yet, or I'll get to it later? Maybe when one of your parents asked you to do a chore, mow the lawn, take out the trash. It's like, hey, yeah, I'll get to it. Not yet, though. I'll get there. And it's like, man, and your intentions are great. You fully plan on taking out the trash, but you just got to finish that last episode of Zumbo's Just Desserts, right? The timer starts going down after one episode finishes, and you're thinking, man, it's too hard to exit out of it. It's just easy to keep watching. 10 episodes later, you still haven't done what you said you were going to do. We don't care about it enough to act swiftly and complete it, but we say not yet as though we do. That was the people of Israel. And as you dig into this story, you really begin to see that the time that the people are referring to in verse 2 is really just a vague and undefined future that justified the people sitting on their tails and continuing to not rebuild the temple. And for this specific scenario, the time for the people that they were probably waiting for was for some political or governmental leader to tell them and support them in rebuilding the temple again. They had been used to King Cyrus sending them home from captivity, supporting their endeavor to rebuild the temple and providing for everything. Well, now Cyrus is gone, and Artaxerxes shows up, and Darius shows up, and it's completely changed. There's opposition, there's resistance. And when opposition hits, what we see with this people is that they give up. They become lethargic about the very place that God longs to and desires and promised to dwell among them. And that's because in their eyes, the timing wasn't right. When God didn't show up as they expected him to do, in the time in which they expected him to do it, they begin to speak for God. And they say, hey, we may not know the exact time, but we know it's not now. They become lazy. And it's not just that they become lazy and neutral, they actually turn inward. They become selfish in their focuses. And they begin to build up their own houses as God's house lies in ruins. And maybe as I'm talking about all this, you're thinking, what in the world does ancient Israel have to do with our story right now in 2020 in the middle of this pandemic? Because as people of faith, their problem and our problem isn't all that different. The problem with promises is that they are time sensitive. But I think the question that Haggai brings up to you and I that we have to wrestle with is, what happens when we aren't sensitive to God's timing? We lose sight of God's promises. When Israel began to view the promises of God through the filter of their circumstances and their own definition of timing, they lost sight of who God was and what he said he was going to do. They got lazy. They focused inward. And I wonder, NYM, if we were to be really honest at this important moment in our lives, have you begun to do the same thing? Have you begun to view those promises of Jesus that he will be with us always, his church will overcome, he has overcome the world, these incredible promises that we say and we hear, have you begun to view those through the filter of a 2020 pandemic and when our government says we can reopen? And have you therefore lost sight of who God is and what he said he's going to do? Have you gotten lazy? Have you turned inward and focused on yourself? Maybe you say, well, I'm just going to wait for the time for things to get back to normal. I'm waiting for the time to get back to small group physically. Then I'll begin to really interact with small group like I used to. I'm waiting for the time to worship in the SMC to really begin to work on that discipline more. I'm waiting for the time to really begin to pick back up where I left off with my walk with God because church really, really helps me. I'm out of rhythm. Look, if you wait for the time to do something for God, the time most likely isn't going to come. You will prioritize other more comfortable things. And so, how are you spending your time right now? Are you building up God's house? Or are you focusing inward? Are you building up your own? Because if it's inward focus, here's what you need to know about how that's going to turn out. Haggai writes, now this is what the Lord Almighty says, give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. God basically says, look, when you are working on your time, you will get your results. It'll come to nothing. Nothing is going to happen. So what do? We, like Haggai writes in verse 7, this is what the Lord Almighty says, give careful thought to your ways. And survey yourself. Ask yourself, how have I done this quarantine season? Am I discouraged because, like Israel, I'm waiting on a government to reopen society for me to get back to the building of my spiritual growth? No, God goes further and says in verse 8, go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. And be it Cyrus, Artaxerxes, Darius, or a worldwide pandemic, God says, your time does not determine my promises. We cannot limit God's promises to our time. We have to act on those promises right now. How do we do that? I think the beauty in all of this is while Israel needed to build a building, build a temple for God's presence and spirit to dwell amongst his people, you and I have something so much better. We, because of Jesus and his death, burial, and resurrection, and him offering to create in us a new heart that builds us up into a temple. So we don't have to wait to come to a place. Jesus has created us to be a temple. Paul would say it this way: do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. What the people of Israel were called to build in order to worship God, you and I, when we accept Jesus, are created into so that we can worship God. Paul says it in another place in Romans. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Man, what does this mean? This means that you don't have to wait to get back to this room, a building that housed us singing songs together. Man, this place was awesome and we can't wait to get back here. But you don't have to wait to get back to this building that holds worship services to passionately pursue God. In fact, I would even say it this way: the intensity of our worship when we get back to this building will be exposed by how intense and passionately you pursue God right now when we're not meeting together. Are you building up God's house now through living your life as a living sacrifice? Or are you turning inward, getting lazy, focusing on yourself? The problem with promises is that they are time sensitive. But what happens when we aren't sensitive to God's timing? We lose sight of God's promises. So NYM, let us not wait for phase 4 of reopening to build up God's house. If we believe in Jesus, then we have the Spirit of God living inside of us right now, something Israel would have paid to have. Don't waste this time at home. And we're going to honor our government and the mandates that they set before us. We're going to continue to wait, but we're also going to consider our ways. We're going to get up. We're going to get supplies. We're going to build up God's house. Why? Because Jesus has said, I've overcome the world. The church will prevail, and I will be with you always. Let's take him at his word and act on those words. Let's move.